it's really a race planning tool. And so we kind of go by these three words that we try and do everything by: predicting, training for specifically for the race, and then actually on race day being able to take what you've learned and what you've done modeling wise and then apply it to the race. So kind of the basics behind it. My background is in optimization mathematics. So excuse some of the noise here. So everything here is very open air. So we get a lot of the wave noise and the road noise and the bird noise and occasionally mongoose noise. So hopefully that will keep to a minimum. But basically, my background is in optimization mathematics. And so what I've done and what we've done at Best Bike Split is we take math and physics, and with that, we can take your power data, we can take information about the course, information about the race day, so weather, wind, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, quite a few things in the background of the model. And what we can do with that is predict your race performance, and then maybe more importantly, create a power plan so that athletes can go out and perform their best on race day. So as I said, our solutions kind of fall into three buckets. So we have the prediction side. So for instance, if you have a goal IF, or intensity factor, which is basically a percentage of your threshold power, or even just a goal wattage, you can input that into the system and then get an estimated, predicted time for what you would finish at that race. But for things like time trials, for instance, you may have a goal time in mind, and from that you can put in a goal time and get what power you need to hit on the race, given the conditions on the day and the course, and also your aerodynamics. And then what we really like to look at for triathletes is targeted training stress score. So if you're not familiar with training stress score, it's kind of a metric that represents both intensity and duration of an effort. So there's a really good post that Joe Friel did back in 2012 called "How to Cheat by Using a Power Meter." And it's still kind of the standard, or how to cheat at Ironman using a power meter. It's kind of the standard TSS chart, or training stress chart, that says good runners should be in this range. If you're a little bit poorer runner, then maybe you're backed off a little bit. And it kind of gave you these ranges of scores to hit. So usually somewhere between 270 TSS and 300 TSS. And so what we can do is, if you're an athlete that has raced before and kind of know a good range for you where you've run well off the bike, we can basically take that data and then not only predict your time, but also the level of effort you need to hit that time. In terms of training, so a lot of times, especially triathletes, like to pre-train a lot of sections of the course at the effort level that would be required on the day. So we provide files and downloads that you could then load into Virtual Trainer, or to ride on your Cyclops, or you could load into a Joule actually and control it that way, but also into things like Trainer Road or CompuTrainer or PeriPedal. So there's other indoor training software, but basically allows you to either via an erg mode or via kind of a simulation mode pre-train sections of the course. And then what we think is most important is on race day actually being able to go out and perform the plan that you have. So typically what we see with our pro athletes that use the software is this kind of cheat sheet. So we break a course down into a flat headwind section, a flat tailwind section, crosswind, and then various gradients of hills, and give kind of a power strategy that says, here's about what type of power you should be hitting in those sections. So we also download into a Garmin and can give power alerts throughout the course that kind of say, here's the power you should be hitting at different sections based on the conditions. So as I said, solution breakdown, just to kind of reiterate, so the three main areas are predicting the power needed to hit a goal time on a specific course and conditions, predicting a finish time for a goal normalized power target. And for those of you who haven't heard the term normalized power before, you can kind of think of it as the power your body feels. So there's the average power, which is the power that goes to the road to propel your bike forward. And then there's the normalized power, which takes into account that intense efforts where you spike your power up are going to do a little bit more stress on the body than if you held a perfectly average or flat power. So your normalized power is kind of your physiological power strain, whereas the average power is what's actually propelling your bike forward. So ideally, for a flat course, those would be 1-to-1. So you would put out 250 watts and your body would feel 250 watts. But on some courses that are a little more up and down, where you have to put a little bit higher effort going uphill and maybe a little less effort going downhill, then you'll start to see some separation in those two numbers. And then, as I said, finally, predict the power and time for a specific training stress score. And this is what we tend to use with most of our triathletes. Usually for a time trial, you'd kind of go either with the time-based model or a real power target model. Train specifically for the course and the conditions with indoor training programs, or take it outdoors. So, if you're doing kind of you want to go out and kind of simulate the conditions, you can do kind of a time to power workout outside that will kind of, stress the same feeling in your legs that you'll feel on race day. And then on the race, executing the race day plan via a cheat sheet that kind of breaks it down by the scenario that you're in. Or we have integrated with the Wahoo elements, so being able to pull that into a head unit and actually follow those on race day. So kind of getting into how it all works in the back end of it, we start with details, so lots of details. And in terms of course details, so both the elevation of the course, so what we call effective elevation gain and loss, so basically looks at significant changes in elevation in terms of climbing. This section's flat, this is a descent. We also look at significant direction changes. So for instance, if you're going south and then suddenly you turn west and there's a wind out of the west, then that's going to be a headwind where it was a crosswind when you were going south. So those kind of details about the course. Also some information about the road condition, because that will affect things like rolling resistance. We take in local weather data. So we actually bring in forecasted weather data for every weather station along the course, the closest weather station along the course at the time we think the athlete will be passing by it. So before the race, if you run the weather, run the model, then basically it's forecasting in 3 hours, you're going to be about here, and here's what the weather will look like 3 hours from now in that part of the course. We bring in athlete power data, so power duration curve or kind of mean max power numbers. We can bring that in as basically constraints on the model. If you know your 10-minute power, you don't want to exceed a certain amount, then that can be a limitation on the model that you set. The math itself actually does a lot of that, which is kind of interesting that if you just run the model without putting some of these constraints in, the way the math works with normalized power and average power, it tends to kind of break it down in a physiological, in a way that makes it physiologically achievable on race day, which is kind of interesting to see. And then rider data, so data about your aerodynamic positioning, your type of wheels you have, the frame, all of those kind of like little details that roll in. And all of that stuff gets pushed into a model. And this is an actual optimization model. We had to blur some stuff out so you couldn't see all of it, but that's kind of a network flow of some of the background model that's actually going. So trying to minimize time. So it's exciting. My wife always says it looks like a spaceship, but to me, anyway. But yeah, so it all goes into this big optimization engine. And then the output of that is basically a power-based race plan. So I believe this may be Mont Tremblant here, so the Ironman Mont Tremblant. But basically, you see in the dark blue is the elevation profile. The light blue is kind of like an erg, so it's saying here are the power targets you should be hitting at the different sections of the course. And then you have an estimated speed. So obviously, if there's a steep descent, steep downhill, you have this nice speed spike. for the pros, I wouldn't be flying down at 65 kilometers an hour, but other, some pros maybe fly down at 65 miles an hour or 65 kilometers an hour. So this is kind of a representation of the output of the model. Typical model, this wouldn't even be an Ironman model, but a typical model is looking at 300,000 independent variables simultaneously. So unlike a simulation, which is simulating one thing and then trying something else and then trying something else, the type of math we're doing is looking at the entire solution space at one time and then trying to break that solution space down to find the kind of the perfect, answer, or at least an answer that meets all the constraints that we have in the model. So one thing I really like to point out is the importance of accuracy in a model. So, in most things, if you have good data in, you'll have an accurate model. If you have bad data in, you're going to tend to get bad data out. So a couple of tips for when you run these kind of models for getting that kind of good data in, around rider and bike data, making sure that you have your correct power threshold values. So, and that you're keeping those up to date. So I would love to say that my FTP today is the same as it was when I was racing 4 or 5 years ago. Unfortunately, it's not. So, and it's quite a bit lower. So I need to make sure that I adjust it. Similarly, if it goes up, then I need to make sure that I adjust those up. So making sure that you have a good idea of the power numbers that you can output, and that you have some good knowledge of that. Height and weight data, specifically on the weight side as you go uphill. If you are physics affects you maybe a little bit more, but also on the downhill you may gain a little bit more if you're if you weigh 165 versus 150 on the downhills, it's adding to your benefit. It's to your benefit. On the uphills, it's the opposite. So making sure that your weight data and that the weight data on your bike is accurate. A lot of people underestimate how heavy their bike is, fully loaded with water bottles and everything else. Even a lot of pro rigs are sitting at 23 pounds. 24 pounds. So just because the bike is like, oh, it's a 15-pound bike, yeah, but then you put your water bottles on it and you've got all your equipment on it and everything else, it changes quite a bit. So your equipment types, so as I mentioned, different types of wheels, making sure that your wheels are, kind of, if your 404 versus an 808, that does make some difference to the model. And then aerodynamic drag, which is typically the hardest thing to nail down. If anybody, for those of you who don't know a lot about drag, the equation is basically CDA. So, or the A part of that, it's a multiplication, and A part of that is area. So it's basically frontal area. What does the wind actually see when you're trying to fight it? And then the CD part of that is your shape, and that's fairly hard to kind of quantify. But what you can do is you can use previous race data to start to estimate what that looks like. And that's something at Best Bike Split we're really going to start focusing on over the next couple of months, is using previous race data to really give athletes and coaches a good idea of what those drag numbers are. It's not going to be perfect. It's not like a wind tunnel or like velodrome testing, but it does kind of give a good estimate. And then once you want to go to the next phase of that, then potentially you've kind of dialed it in enough that you go, okay, now I can go and test it with the real equipment. And finally, power. So our power is very important. So knowledge of your athlete, or if you're a coach, your athlete's power duration curve. And I can't stress it enough, a well-calibrated, accurate power meter. It's great that we're doing this with PowerTap, because I did all my initial testing and development of the model with a PowerTap hub. It was, you have power that's at the wheel, it's getting it right off the ground. That power is being transferred to the ground. So it made it really, really nice to be able to test things in real world and say, oh, I think this works, and now let me go test it. Since then, I've been using, PowerTap pedals as well, and doing a lot of work to look at the pedals versus looking at the hub. And the accuracy is really important for physics modeling. A lot of people say, well, as long as it's consistent, it's great. And that's true for training. As long as you have a consistent power meter, that's great for training. But when you really want to do physics-based modeling and try and do it at this level, then you have to have an accurate power meter. So that's something that we really like to stress when we're running models. And of course data. So elevation is a very hard thing to kind of nail down. We've done a lot of work over the past 2 months to enhance the way we look at elevation. So smoothing over bridges and doing all these kind of things that are tricky. We've gotten much better at doing that. So, and in the case of trying to do the race plan on race day, you want to make sure a lot of GPS devices, you look at it and you zoom in and you go, well, that's not on the road at all. It says I'm going through this field and I'm doing that. And so, making sure course data follows the road, and so that when you're out there, it knows where you are and it's realistic. So, setting yourself up for race day success is what we want to do. So, I like to tell everybody it's not called fastest bike split. It's called best bike split. So it's not necessarily the fastest time, but it's the strategy, that gets you to the finish line fastest. In a time trial, yeah, it's probably the fastest time for your given ability. But in an Ironman or even a short distance triathlon, it's not. You can lose the race on the bike. It's very hard to win it outright on the bike. Back in the day, you can count on one hand how many Uber bikers have gone out and just really smashed it without having with being subpar runners. So Stadler was probably the last one to really, do that. Kienle won a couple of years ago with an amazing bike time, but he followed it up with a really good run time as well. So, what you want to do is basically be able to get off the bike and still have your greatest run, so a complete package. So some of the things that I hadn't thought about, and actually coaches have brought this up to me, is you could set your power targets to make sure that you meet the bike cutoff time at an Ironman. A lot of first timers are very nervous about going and racing long distance, Ironman, half Ironman, and if you can tell them and give them confidence, hey, if you hit these numbers, you're going to meet your bike cutoff time, then you're going to get on the run, and it's going to be a great day. And even if you take some breaks and do some other things, and I think that's something I had never thought of, but it is a good use of the software. Really help newbies understand and visualize correct pacing techniques. So we work with quite a few pro athletes, but we also work with a lot of age groupers and a lot of coaches. And what we find out is that pros tend to pace really, really well. They've been doing it a long time. This is both on time trial and triathlon. And new people to the sport, oftentimes, and I was always guilty of it as well, you get off the bike and you're so amped up and you just blast out and you're going full throttle and you're not even paying any attention to what your body's saying, and your heart rate's starting to creep up and all these things. And really being able to show somebody, hey, this is how you pace, and this is how it's almost like a limiter, trying to get in there and say, do this, and at the end of the race you're going to be feeling good, as opposed to just feeling good for the first 20 miles of the race. We've mentioned quite a few times, and I do like to stress it, that targeting a known training stress score where you have a good run off the bike, and setting realistic time expectations. So Ironman Florida, Ironman Wisconsin, very different races. So if you went out and did 220 at Ironman Florida, at Ironman Wisconsin, that may not be the best strategy. You may be walking, quite a bit of the run if you stayed at that same intensity level. Benefit of a proper bike fit. So the cool thing, being in the booth here at Kona and having people come by, is a lot of them are saying, man, I really love the software, but at the same time, also really, it showed me how poor my positioning was. Like, you go in there and if your drag is really, poor, you can kind of see and say, hey, if I get a little bit better drag, then my time just starts melting away on some of these courses. So I like to respond to that and go, hey, well, it's kind of free speed unless you have to buy new wheels and buy a new frame and buy all that stuff. But if it's just a positioning thing, you can start to work on that and train it over time. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Also, for those of you who are doing time trials and stuff, or have quite a few different setups, finding the best bike or wheel setup for a specific course, and then comparing race times for current fitness with anticipated race day fitness. So I know my power levels are this now. I think I can get a 5% bump by race day. I can start to look at those things. And then, of course, gives another justification for athletes to purchase power meter as if they didn't need enough already. We're very excited about more people with power meters is awesome. So the options that are out there now with PowerType has 3 options and all of them are awesome. Yeah, it's just it's a great time for us. So we're excited about it. All right, so now we've gone through all that spiel. Let's get into like BBS in the real world. So this is kind of interesting. I know it's a couple years old now, but it was really cool for us at Best Bike Split to get this. This is actually from an email TJ Tollakson sent me after the race, and he said, I'm really impressed with what you guys are doing, and thanks for the analysis and time. It looks amazing. And what I didn't realize is actually that he signed up for Best Bike Split via his manager at the time and used the software for Ironman Mont Tremblant. Didn't actually tell us till after the fact and after he had won the race. And so some of the details of what his Best Bike Split plan were versus actual performance. Hopefully this is visible, but basically the things to kind of point out. We had a little bit slower time than what he actually did by almost about a minute, but it was also a little bit longer course that we had than what his data showed. But what's really cool is, you look at the variability index and, you're looking, if you don't know, variability index is the difference between normalized power and average power. And typically for almost every triathlon, you want to stay under a 1.05. So he's sitting there at a 1.018. I mean, a 1.1 basically, or 1.02. And so that means he rode a very steady, even ride. And if you know Mont Tremblant course, there are some hills and some other things on that. And so to ride this steady a ride is very impressive. But then also what he told us is he wanted to break the bike record at the time. And I think it was a 4:30 at the time. And he thought he was going to have to go out and do 300 watts to do it. He said, I'm going to have to go out and blast out 300 watts. And what the model showed him is that, no, you could go out and do 20 watts less and still obliterate the record. And so basically he took that, and that's what he did on race day. He said, okay, I'm going to do this. On this hill, I'm going to do a certain wattage. I may do 320 watts up some of these hills, but I'm going to keep it in check. And then I'm going to hold at 280 on these steady sections. And what I like to always show is here's the original plan that he did. And then if we overlay like what his actual power looked like from the day, you can start to see that he is really following the plan to a T. And it's really cool to kind of see that and go, whoa. There were a couple of places where he deviated. And one was he had actually Raylert was right on his right behind him. So up the first climb, he spiked it a few times in a row. You can kind of see those big spikes at around 75 to 100K. And he actually maybe paid for it a little bit later, but he broke away from Raylert. So then he was out by himself and could ride his own ride. So it was really cool to see that. So that's something we like to point out. A lot of people talk about, watts per kg, and watts per kg is very important metric. It's really important in road racing. In most triathlons and a lot of TTs, while it's still important, the courses that you guys ride on as a triathlete or as a time trialist don't tend to be extremely hilly. So if you kind of just look at the importance of aerodynamics, we've kind of broken it down, but at 24 miles an hour, so at 30 miles an hour at the extreme, if you're sitting on a road bike, you're pushing basically just to overcome the drag that you're producing by yourself, with no wind whatsoever, so no headwind, just if it's a calm day, you're having to push over 500 watts to hit those kind of, sustained speeds. And so you start to look at, as I get more aerodynamic, so on the right-hand side, you see the little numbers in parentheses. So those are CDA numbers. It's very rare that anybody can get to that bottom one, that aero bar optimal, where you're pushing 300 watts for 30 miles an hour. But, you can see that it makes a very big difference the faster you go. So up a hill, it doesn't matter so much. So that's why on, a steep hill, if you're at 13 miles an hour, 14 miles an hour, you sit up, it's not as big a penalty. But as you start to go faster and faster, those differences are not linear. They become, exponential. So getting a good aerodynamic position that is also comfortable, because if you have an aerodynamic position that you're out of 40% of the race because it's not very comfortable, then it blows up any of the time savings that you got. Just to kind of put it in reference, tire drag, which we'll call CRR, rolling resistance, it is linear. So the faster you go, it does tend to take a little bit more effort to overcome that resistance, but it's minimal compared to the drag that you're experiencing. Most good triathletes can fall into that 0.23 to 0.26 CDA range. A lot of the pros are now know how big a benefit this is, so they're dialing it in, and most of them are somewhere between 0.23 and 0.24. A lot of the age groupers that tend to be out on the course a little bit longer, so they want to be a bit more comfortable or kind of on the higher end of that range. But everybody can get kind of in that range, so it just takes a little bit of work and training. So I mentioned this, and this is a good example. Ironman St. George 70.3 is a hilly course. It is a very hard course, and the U.S. Pro Tour, or the U.S. 70.3 Champs was there this year. And what I like to kind of look at, and one thing you can do with Best Bike Split is start to look at, hey, what if I lost some weight, or what if I got slightly more aerodynamic, and you can start to see the benefits of that. So in this case, 70.3, this is data from actually from one of the Training Peaks employees, Dave. So sorry, Dave, got to give him your numbers. But at St. George, if he was going to hold basically 210 watts with his current position, his current weight, he was going to hit around 2 hours and 37 minutes.